very interesting diplomatic development here. And this shows you, again, the tightrope that I alluded to. Let's put this up there on the screen. India and China, which all eyes are on, of course, with regards to this situation, the two great powers which are not backing Russia but not also being as adversarial, actually criticized Russia after the strikes, calling for de-escalation. Now, to be clear, they did not name Russia specifically, but as when Prime Minister Modi said that the world desires peace while sitting right next to Vladimir Putin, it's kind of a screw you in very coded language. First, from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, here's what they said, quote, "All countries deserve respect for their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Support should be given to all efforts that are conducive to peacefully resolving the crisis." Now, from the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, here's what New Delhi says. India is deeply concerned at the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, including targeting of infrastructure and deaths of civilians. So anyway, the Indian response there is probably the most direct criticism yet that they have given of Putin. Why does it matter? Well, they remain one of the top customers of Russian oil. And I do think it bears parsing as to how the Indians in particular are approaching this. And even in the Chinese, they're like, listen, if you're going to sell us cheap oil, we'll take that oil. They're like, but don't mistake for a second that we support, bombing of critical infrastructure in Ukraine. And it's also a little bit of a lesson for Putin of, yeah, you might want to go total war but if you do, you will lose your last two standing customers who are funding basically the entire war effort. He really has put himself in a very strategic pickle. And I think for him to have zero allies in this fight except for Belarus, I mean, look, that's a bad situation to be in. And it just highlights how strategically dumb the invasion was in the first place. Also shows you how precarious their situation is they can't really commit beyond what they're already doing without possibly risking the loss of their largest oil customers on the globe.
Yeah. Well, Saudi is backing them up, so they've got some friends
That's
there.
True.
We'll get to that in a little bit. Yeah. I think also from the India and China perspective, part of the rub with these countries with regards to the West is this feeling of all these international organizations and rules of the global order, not to say that in the conspiratorial sense, but these are all set up by the US and by the West, and they feel like they're given a sort of second-class status within that order. So in the beginning of this, when it was Russia is challenging that order, and maybe we're going to sort of wait and see how this plays out. Well, now they're seeing how it's playing out, and it's not playing out that well for Russia. So it's important to remember that these new comments, these are not the first comments that China and India have made that have been at least obliquely critical of Russia. There was that summit in Uzbekistan last month. They say it was meant to be a show of force for Putin, but the leader had to acknowledge that Xi Jinping of China had raised, quote, questions and concerns about the war. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was more public and direct, describing how the war has exacerbated challenges for developing countries. He told Putin at the summit their meeting would be, quote, a chance to discuss how we can move forward on the path of peace. And, these are also countries that have their own domestic political considerations that they have to think about. I mean, they are also being hit with inflation. China seems to be facing a lot of economic woes and difficulties. So, the fact that this war has exacerbated some of these crises for their own domestic population is obviously a consideration here as well. But quite noteworthy, the increasing arm's length distancing of these two countries that Russia, in particular with China, thought they'd be able to rely on the beginning.
Yeah, I think there's no other way to describe it as of a real problem for Putin to be in this situation. And everybody has their own domestic political concerns. I think the clear answer from New Delhi is, hey, we're willing to stand up to the West as long as we're getting this cheap oil and we're able to do it without incurring any costs. But if you go too far and you're going to incur us costs, then this entire deal is up. And the precarity then of the Russian economy really can't be overstated. I mean, over and over again, the Russian oil markets and Russia really has been saved both by OPEC and by the supply shock. But that is a dangerous situation to have only one or two customers that you can be wholly reliant on in order to backstop your economy. And that means you have to placate them very, very, very carefully. I think that New Delhi, the moment that they would have to face a UN resolution that would actually, or sanctions possibly by the West, some type of thing, they would pull the plug on their relationship. That's what they've always done. They've basically played the West and the Russians against each other, and we're like, we'll go with whoever's going to give us a deal, is going to give us most weapons. Very Indian, I think, in their handling it. As far as the Chinese,
you can say that, I can't.
Yeah, I'll say it. As far as I mean, they've been doing it basically since the Cold War. It's kind of interesting. It's called the non-aligned movement. Anyway, in terms of the Chinese, same thing, which is that they like the chaos. They like actually the West being pinned down in Europe. So they'll backstop the Russians, but they're not going to sell them any weapons. They haven't done so. I mean, the North Koreans right now are taking advantage of that. If Russia really was in a pickle, would they come and save them? I'm not so sure, because they too also don't want to suffer those consequences, and they don't want the trouble to be directly on them. Again, they're just like the Indians. They'll take the cheap oil if they can get it.
And this is why, when there's, we've been over this a couple times, but I keep hearing this argument being made, so I really want to underscore why I think it's silly and facile of an argument, this idea that like, oh, if you negotiate with Russia at all, if they end up getting anything out of this, then they're going to be emboldened, they're going to roll into another country, or other rogue regimes around the world are going to look at this and say, you know what, we should do this too because Russia ultimately got X or Y or Z out of this deal. Like, this has been an unmitigated disaster for Putin, for Russia. I mean, for him personally, in terms of his grip on power, there seem to be cracks. It has not gone well in terms of the war effort. It has not gone well in terms of their economic standing. It has not gone well in terms of their international standing. I cannot imagine any leader around the world looking at this and saying, that's an experience I want to replicate, right? Even if there was some sort of like, they end up with Crimea or something like that, no one is going to look at this and be like, that was great for them and I want to do the same thing.
I mean, I tend to agree.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.